Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up. And today, what a program I have for you. I have two of the most gifted people, they may be called public intellectuals, certainly two of the great minds that I know in public affairs, in foreign affairs, in the business of the nation. And they're going to talk to us about foreign policy going forward. Not the things we talk of every day in Washington, but the long American interest in the remainder of President Obama's presidency. You're going to want to hear this. It's going to be super. I've talked to them already, and we're going to get into this when we come back in a few seconds.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. And now, the program host, nationally syndicated columnist Llewellyn King, and co-host Linda Gasparello.
Hello again, and thank you so much for coming along. And right to our great guests. First, Ambassador James Dobbins, who has been variously an Assistant Secretary of State, a Special Envoy, Ambassador to the European Community, one of the great public servants of American foreign policy, indeed of the American people. Ambassador, it's a wonder to have you at the table.
Thank you.
A delight. And my old friend and your old friend, Amitai Etzioni, Professor of Sociology, with, again, a long list of credits that include some of the great universities, Harvard, Columbia, Berkeley, and of course the founder of the Communitarian movement, which is a concept in communitarianism, also on how society could organize itself. Also the author of many books, but today we have with us Hotspots, American Foreign Policy in a Post-Human Rights World by Professor Amitai Etzioni, published last October. Very current, very worth reading. And right to the subject, foreign policy. Where do you think the Obama administration will have most of its attention? Will it be, Ambassador, in the Middle East or the Far East? Will it be Europe or will it be a mix?
Well, they'd like to shift their attention to Asia, to the rising challenges of China, to some of the hot spots there that could potentially lead to conflict. They're probably not going to be able to, as events will continue to draw them to areas where they'd rather not be engaged, or certainly not heavily engaged. At the moment, one of their main focuses is Africa, rather surprisingly, with the growth of militant and terrorist movements throughout Saharan Africa. They're not going to be able to escape the Middle East. The situation in Syria is deteriorating as we speak. That country is likely to fragment in ways that will be potentially catastrophic for 25 million of its citizens and potentially destabilizing for several of its neighbors.
What's the good news? Is there any good news out there?
I mean, there's lots of good news in the sense that, you know, globally and in contrast to other eras, either the first half of the 20th century or even the second half of the 20th century, the world's a lot safer. We spend a lot of time worrying about terrorism, but actual deaths and attacks by terrorists are down significantly from what they were in the 80s, the 90s, or even in the last decade. The number of conflicts around the world is down. The number of conflicts between nations is almost completely eliminated. We don't face a peer competitor. There's no Soviet Union, there's no Nazi Germany, and China doesn't seem to be intent on competing with us in that fashion, at least not anytime soon. So there's lots of positive things going on.
It does seem to have territorial ambitions in the South China Sea, though.
It has claims to several small rocks and islands there, and those claims are countered by other nations, the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan in the North China Sea. We don't recognize the Chinese claims, but neither do we recognize the claims of the other countries. we're urging that they be settled peacefully. But it's possible that one of those could escalate into something that would involve the United States. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible.
It's alarmist to say that there's a chance of hostilities between Japan and China.
Well, it's not alarmist to say there's a chance of them. It would be alarmist to suggest that chance is very high.
Amitai, tell me about your book.
Well, the best way for me to get to that is to continue what I very much agree what Ambassador Dobbins just pointed out. President Obama, in his inaugural speech and in the State of the Union, sent about as clear a signal as is possible that he wants to be, the next 4 years, a domestic president. He wants to engage in nation building at home. And foreign policy was barely mentioned. Actually, I don't recall the State of the Union or an inaugural address where so little attention was paid to foreign policy. And I very much agree that the international reality will not allow that to happen. By the way, I think the domestic reality will not allow it to happen either. He will find out very soon, and all of us, regrettably, that he cannot avoid a much stronger commitment internationally. So then you come to the question, which I think is the question for the next 4 years. How you square our need to rebuild our own economy, our infrastructure, our education system, the famous list, and live up to your international obligations. How to square that. And my response in the book and otherwise is that it can be done if you narrow your commitments, not geographically, but to keeping what I would call law and order as distinct from nation building. And let me quickly highlight this by what happened in Libya. Libya cost us no casualties and $1 billion. You can have 500 Libyas for one Afghanistan. Afghanistan, we can argue, because there's only 660 billion so far, or another X. So what is the difference? Well, there are many differences, of course, geographic and so on and so on. But one of the major differences is that we did not put large conventional troops into Libya, that we rely in part more on other partners, and above all, we limited our goals to stopping the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, but not that we now have to make Libya into some kind of a mini Switzerland or anything like it. So we limited our goals. Look what happened in Kosovo. We had no casualties, minimum cost, great success, because the goal was limited. We are, in my judgment, in great trouble in Iraq still, and in Afghanistan, because we took on much more. Again, the early stage of the war in Iraq worked very easily and well. It's then where we decided to stay and nation build, which among others cost at least 100,000 lives. That's where we get into trouble. It has an additional implication. China and Russia, and that's, I think, has not been widely reported, are willing to subscribe to the notion that the genocide should be stopped. They have their own reason, but they're not willing to support what amounts, in effect, to forced regime changes. Now, a very interesting point in what happened in Libya. We intervened originally to prevent slaughtering the people in Benghazi, a humanitarian intervention. Then, as the rebel forces, with our help, progressed and were threatening Tripoli and the Gaddafi regime, Gaddafi said, all right, let's stop here and negotiate. By the way, it's very similar now happened in Syria. And we decided at that point that was not good enough. We did not say, fine, as long as there's no slaughtering, no killing, both sides would agree, that's all we need to assure. We said, no, he has to go and the regime has to go. And that's where we have now trouble and anarchy, though this time it's not on our ticket. So first of all, we need to focus our foreign policy not on nation building, not on large conventional troops, but on keeping, let's call it law and order. And then we come exactly to the Middle East. For me, the hotspots are, first of all, Iran, and second, Pakistan. Pakistan is actually relatively easy
Go ahead.
to show the issue. There have been already 6 attempts by Taliban or Al-Qaeda or some combination to penetrate the place to keep the nuclear weapon.
Can you boil this down into a positive philosophy, or is it a general inclination? Can it be turned into a kind of a manifesto for foreign policy?
Yes, I think there is one human right which outranks all others, and that's the one we should pay first, second, and third attention, is keeping people alive. The right to vote, all this can come later. First of all, we should keep them alive.
What do you see in the Middle East, Jim?
Well, as I said, I think the main concern at the moment is the situation in Syria. There are problems, obviously, with the Iranian nuclear program. I tend to think that that's achieved a certain equilibrium. The Iranians edge up to the line that might cause us to take action, and then they edge back again. And I think they will avoid crossing that line. Are the Israelis
edging closer to that?
I think the Israelis recognize they don't have the capability of doing anything definitive with respect to the Iranian program, and that they're dependent on us.
Do you think we will ever see in Israel a two-state solution, or is that really a thing, a hope that came and went, and we haven't had the moral courage to face it?
I think the chances of a two-state solution diminish as the Israeli settlements policy goes forward, as it occupies more and more of the West Bank, and as Israeli politics moves to the right. I wouldn't say that the chance is diminished entirely, but eventually the focus of American and European diplomacy may have to turn from a two-state solution to ensuring that Israel gives full political rights to all of the people who are under its jurisdiction.
Which would be the Palestinians it would be a single-state solution.
Yes, which ironically is what Hamas supports, and
where
Israel seems to be going.
Used not to like, because the fear that population growth would be so great in the
Eventually, it would
community.
mean that you'd have a non-Jewish majority. That's correct, which is, of course, the main argument for this two-state solution, but it's not one that's making that much headway in the region.
It had an interesting parallel in Northern Ireland, where the growth of the Catholic minority and the birth rate being higher, if it just waited, the Catholics would have been superior electorally.
And they will be eventually. I mean, it's
course.
continuing to move in that direction.
Great surprises change foreign policy. Things suddenly, journalists are getting out maps to look at parts of the world they'd never heard of. Do you sense anything that may be quietly cooking that could erupt?
Well, the nature of sudden changes is that they are unpredictable. We certainly wouldn't have thought that we'd invade Afghanistan in August of 2001. When the Cold War ended in 1989, we didn't have any idea that we would spend 10 years with significant troop commitments in the Balkans. Just a few months ago, we weren't worried about Mali as a source of terrorism and instability. So I think the answer is no. I mean, I'm no better at predicting the unpredictable than anyone else. But I do think it's important for people to understand that, as you've suggested, that we're not going to be able to pick and choose, and that we don't know where the next challenge is going to come from.
I want to talk about human rights when we come back. A little station identification here. You are listening to White House Chronicle. This is primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, where this program can be heard every Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, and 9:30 p.m. Eastern. Also, it can be seen around the world on the English language television stations of the Voice of America and on 200 public and public access stations here in the United States. If you want to catch up with old programs, or to see this one again, or to see one in the future, you can also see it on the internet at whchronicle.com. They are posted every Monday afternoon after the weekend broadcast. Either of you, we had a definition almost in Jimmy Carter's time, not a highly regarded president, except for the one area that he had a deep concern with human rights, And it was my feeling, and I think it was reflected around the world, that he gave the concept that every human being had a little space around them, a little entitlement to their own security of mind and body. And this was a great power that political prisoners, oppressed people, could feel, I know who I am and I have an entitlement, and the President of the United States knows that I have an entitlement, even if he cannot do anything about it. Then we sort of abstracted human rights after that to a rather larger but less easily comprehensible doctrine. How do you feel about that, Jim?
Well, I think that there have been major advances made in democratization and with it human rights since the Carter era. There's what has been called the third wave of democratization, which began in the 1970s in places like Greece and Portugal and Spain, then moved to South America, to Argentina, to Brazil, to Chile, to essentially every country in the Western Hemisphere except Cuba, and then moved into Eastern Europe. All of Eastern Europe became democratic, and much of Asia, except China, and even parts of Africa. So there was a huge wave which brought 40% of the world's people into functioning democratic systems. Now, that wave has slowed somewhat, but then you have the Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring hasn't produced perfect democracies or even imperfect democracies yet, but it's broken up decades of authoritarian governments, and there's a chance that several of those countries will make it to stable democracy.
If it becomes a theocracy, or if each individual country becomes a theocracy, that's as dictatorial and as repressive almost as anything that preceded it.
I guess it would depend on what you mean by a theocracy. States that have established religions and give a certain role for religion in society and in laws. Israel is such a state, for instance. European states have formally, at least, religious bases. So it's a question of how far the role of Islam in politics goes. And if you look at so far the experiences in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere, you see a significant range from very moderate Islamist politics in Turkey, for instance, to rather extremist versions of the same. We're just going to have to wait and see how this turns out. But I wouldn't begin by assuming that every party that has a religious basis is going to turn out to be repressive.
You're listening to former Ambassador James Dobbins of the RAND Corporation. I now turn to Professor Amitai Etzioni of the George Washington University and the author of the book that is in front of me here, Hotspots, American Foreign Policy in a Post-Human Rights World, published last October. Where do you see the crystallization of the concept of human rights? I like the Jimmy Carter idea that you could insert this idea into a non-democratic, oppressive regime, and that the individual could feel the strength of this concept, know who you are, that you are a human being, and that entitles you to life, and maybe to a little more than life. How do you approach human rights, Amitai?
Well, it's a well-taken point. I served in the Carter White House, and you're indeed correct that he helped. I don't think he was the first necessarily.
Wasn't the Argentinian Timmerman who wrote so well about this?
Indeed. He succeeded in giving a lot of more moral underwriting to the concept, and due to him and others, it now is really widely accepted on a global level, and the most interesting sociological indicator is that countries like in Singapore and China, who used to scoff at human rights and said it's a Western idea, don't bother us, now tend to say, oh, we do respect human rights, we just do it our own way, we're going to do it later, or but they pay homage to the concept. So that shows you how strong a global norm it came. But Jimmy Carter also was able to do very little. So the issue here is, I very much agree that there was a global wave, but it was not an American generated by and large. So the question is, how far can we go in our foreign policy to promote this? To the degree that we engage in what I call non-lethal means, running it up the flagpole, preaching about not waving our finger in other people's faces, we can make progress.
This is a very delicate point for American foreign policy, isn't it? Not to wave fingers, which we've tended to do over the years. I remember years ago when we said, wasn't it awful that women had to drive tractors in the Soviet Union? Now we've changed our own views. We want women fighting in the front line. Driving a tractor is pretty small stuff by comparison. We do tend to approach it. I personally thought that Bill Clinton was very skillful in China in dealing with Tiananmen Square and the massacre, but not dwelling on it. His first speech somewhat touched on. The second one was much more transcendental, much more about the human condition, and much more elevating. The one he delivered when he was at Beijing University.
That's what, but earlier, you talked about surprises, and I think a surprise is coming. Look at China and what's going to happen next. And again, I agree, we can't predict the future, but I will nevertheless take the chance here. We have this tendency to take a country and see it as the next global power which has all the answers which we should emulate. Japan for years was kind of the
went
country.
Germany, Japan, China, back to Germany and China.
And the European Union was supposed to be the next global power, according to some colleagues. China is going to go the other way. It faces so many challenges between its aging population, its environmental challenges, the social tension between increasing access to communication technologies and an authoritarian regime, the fact that it has 4 times more people than we have. People keep talking about its total economy growing, but they forget the income per capita of China is rather low compared to Guatemala and even below that. So this projection that China is not just a rising regional power, which to some extent it is, but a global power, is just disregards. It does the worst social science mistake, what's called straight line projection.
Picking up on Amitai remarks, Jim, isn't it a fact, though, that when you get internal problems in a country, like China, a big country, dictatorial in its way, that one of the ways of diverting attention from that is an external adventure, as we saw with Argentina and the Falklands, etc. Doesn't that increase the danger in the South China Sea and in Asia generally, that as things get more difficult internally for China, they're likely to have an external expression to raise up nationalism in China and quiet local discontent in China?
It's not impossible, and that's certainly something that the United States needs to hedge against by retaining its capabilities and its relationships in that region and encouraging other regional powers to take the steps necessary to defend their own national interests. Neither is it a certainty or even a probability, but I think Amitai is right that China faces a number of demographic, environmental, and other challenges that are going to slow its growth from the unprecedented levels that we've seen, almost unprecedented levels we've seen over the last 20 years, to something somewhat lower, and that the straight line projections that most analysts tend to favor when they're talking about China as the next competitor are probably exaggerated. On the other hand, China is the only country in the world that has even vaguely the potential of becoming a peer competitor with the United States, and so one can't ignore that possibility altogether.
We haven't, and most of these conversations do not embrace much discussion or any discussion of India. And yet has India, with a population almost the same size as China's, a little smaller, a democracy that's hung together amazingly since 1948, which, given the number of religions, languages, I'm never sure if it's 43 languages and 63 religions or 63 languages and 43 religions, but it's quite extraordinary, which is why English is so important to them. plus the historical connection. Where does India fit into this new Asia that we should be paying more attention to?
Well, some Americans have seen India as a counterweight to China and as a potential American ally in that regard. I don't think India is going to become an American ally, but it will become...
It's never shown much enthusiasm for being an American ally, has it?
No. I mean, I think it will become a partner in some respects, and it is to some degree, quite independently of its relationship with the United States, a counterweight to China. But India's growth rates are lower than China's. It's probable that the two will converge over the next decade, that China's will lower slightly and India will continue or even increase its. It's not likely that India's growth rate will increase over China's, and therefore, at best, India is going to stay where it is in relationship to China. In other words, it's not going to get stronger vis-a-vis China. It's been getting weaker vis-a-vis China. It may no longer become weaker and will stay where it is in terms of its power.
You have actually two rather different economic systems. I'm not talking about capitalism and alleged communism, that strange hybrid you have in China, but you have one that's hugely export-driven. China is export-driven. Its economy is export-driven, whereas India is much less export-driven and is much likelier to have a large internal market, which could cause it to grow quite substantially.
Well, I think China is going to move toward more domestic driven growth, and India is probably going to move more toward export growth, and the two economies are likely to converge in terms of their performance.
In the last few moments, what's the message from your book that people who are rude enough not to buy it should take away?
The greatest threat to our security continues to be the combination of terrorists and nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. Any
And that is in Pakistan, and
possibly North Korea.
And our tilting to India makes us drive Pakistan into the arms of China.
That's our show for today. Thank you very much
Pleasure.
indeed, Dr. Dobbins, and thank you very much, Dr. Etzioni. I'm Llewellyn King, and I'll see you at the same place next time, next week. Cheers.
White House Chronicle is produced in collaboration with WHUT, Howard University Television. From Washington, D.C., this has been White House Chronicle, a weekly analysis of the news with insight and a sense of humor, featuring Llewellyn King, Linda Gasparello, and guests. This program may be seen on PBS stations and cable access channels. To view the program online, visit us at whitehousechronicle.com.